Forward TV. The world is thinking.
Well, just to welcome you to this session, one of a strand by the Future Cities Project and supported by BDP and Blueprint. I'm Austin Williams, I'm the director of the Future Cities Project, and this session actually is a follow-on to an event which we held 2 weeks ago, organised by the first speaker, Martyn Perks, at the Design Museum, which was taking a look at how designers, to a certain extent, have lost their nerve in their ability to justify their designs in terms of design. That you have very instrumental justifications for work, whether it be the fact that certain designs improve behaviour, whether certain designs improve student performance, or whether they improve patient recovery patterns in hospitals. There's an incredibly expanding dialogue on this in design land, especially in the architectural world, looking at instrumental reasons for design as a justification. And that was just generally trying to get a thesis together that maybe design is having a little bit of a existential crisis. This one is the second discussion in that thesis, which is really trying to take a look at designing behaviour, which is that designers are more and more getting involved in this kind of way of looking for good outcomes. That good design, which may have been in the past had some kind of either aesthetic judgment call, now the word good also means responsible, sustainable, ecological, whatever it might be. There's a kind of a slight moral agenda which is being positioned here. And this is about design in its broadest sense, even though the panelists will speak on certain closed themes, because they've only got 5 minutes to speak. But we want to try and broaden it out. So there's examples on design in its broadest sense, from product design through graphics to architecture to engineering. Please feel free to raise any questions. I was at the Intersections Conference in Newcastle for the last couple of days, organised by John Thackeray, called .07, Design of the Times, 2007. And that was very much a kind of key theme at the discussion, that John Thackeray, in the final session on Thursday, said that we as designers know nothing, we have to learn from the children. And that was the kind of culminating point of the first day, and it went downhill from there. So something we need to address. And just in the paper today, and there's actually quite a few examples, but this is the mass market hydrogen car. We're ready to roll. Again, design in its kind of automotive sense, but the mass market hydrogen car, which costs £50,000, it's somehow got some kind of ethical kudos behind it. The one I mentioned yesterday, the £1,000 people's car in India, has all sorts of criticisms leveled against it for introducing car transport to a country which actually has enough bicycles to go around. So really kind of there's a whole level of kind of political interventions in this discussion. Anyway, that's your lot. I'll introduce the speakers in the order in which they're speaking. First of all, on the far right, your left, is Martyn Perks, who's a design consultant at Seascape, where he works on audience and communication strategies. So there's no pressure on him to sound impressive. He also, like I say, ran the Design in Denial event at the Design Museum and is working on a book on communities, and is also looking at a whole series of events to run on design next year at the Design Museum, and hopefully with the help of the Design Council. Secondly, we have Molly Webb. Molly Webb works for the Climate Change Group. She was part of a genuinely fascinating research project looking at innovation in China, India, and Korea, and recently written a demos pamphlet, The Disruptors, The Disruptors, Lessons for Low Carbon Innovation, which is free downloadable from the Demos website, and actually does kind of take a look at some very, very interesting examples. And then finally we have Professor Tony Dunne, who's a Professor of Design Interventions, apparently used to be called Intervention Design. Design Interact, oh sorry, Design I get carried away with this kind of instrumentalist idea. Yeah, sorry, Design Interactions, I beg your pardon. And one half of Dunne work is exhibited at MoMA and the V&A, amongst other places, and I gather the aim of their work is to act as an encouragement to talk about social and ethical implications of design. which again is the essence of the actual course that they run here at the RCA. So this session will look at the role, the purpose and the changing perceptions of design, and primarily designers, and take a look at some issues to do with ethical design. So Martyn, kick us off please.
Hi. Okay, I'm going to hopefully get everything done in 5 minutes, and basically start off by making a number of key assertions, and I want to use a couple of examples to make some of those clear, and then finish with what I kind of think about how these examples are bearing out. So firstly, I want to say that I think that design establishment is fated like no other time, from all quarters, from business politics to all aspects of culture. It's an incredibly interesting time to be a designer, because obviously you're getting work from new quarters where you never had it before. Secondly, we need to ask, I think, but is design best placed to help those with moribund agendas such as politics and business, who themselves struggle to justify what they're about? Can design really add value there? Thirdly, I also think our aspirations of what design really is about and capable of is very low and dumbed down and confused. I think we need design to be much better, more innovative and creative than it currently is. And fourthly, I think we are left with design solutions, which I'm going to come on to now, which actually hold us, the buying public, the citizen, as responsible for their solutions and how to actually enable these products to happen, rather than us demanding from our designers, people like me, to inspire us instead with more creative solutions. Now, I want to kind of focus on really, I suppose, how design is becoming part and parcel of developing social policy around, say, education, health, and such like examples like that, and also perhaps keys into wider sustainable agendas, which I'm questioning if this is really a healthy thing for design to do. I'm probably just going to use one example because of time, and I can come back to others in the discussion. And it's really pick up on the Intersections conference that Austin mentioned, which is part of the Design of the Times Festival that happened in what is happening in the Northeast, run by a guy called John Thackeray, who's pretty much been funded by the Design Council, I think the local area authority in the Northeast, to come up with ways that, as he puts it, can kind of pretty much through people explore the practical ways that we can live better, more modern lives, but crucially with less stuff. This is what design for him is meaningful, and what we need to think about when we are designing the modern world. So for Thackeray, stuff is the problem, and we need less of it. And importantly for him, at the point of where a product has been produced and is in our shops, for him is actually too late. What he wants us to do is to come together with the people who will be using that stuff, those services, those education resources, and think of ways how we can better streamline those systems and services to end up with less stuff, if you like, in our shelves, and less resources that drain on the environment and everything else. So for me, it's quite a narrow set of objectives, because it doesn't really place the objective in terms of producing more stuff that we can use and consume and better our lives through a better standard of living through putting design into use and using technology in new innovative ways. It seems to be about the opposite, about curtailing what we can actually live with, but that for him is a reasonable life to live. So a couple examples. He has various programs that he's developed over the last 23, 24 months. One is around food. Can we, in the Northeast, produce our own food, basically, in a more sustainable, organic way that, again, limits the drain on resources, central resources, reduces the travel miles that food producers have to move the food around with and so on. So ended up basically with him getting 8,000 people in the Northeast to grow their own vegetables. However, my experience when my dad grew his vegetables in his own allotment meant that I didn't want to eat them. I'm less able to buy into this approach of homegrown is good, when actually supermarkets really, for me, are the better way of producing more tasteful, tasty stuff. Secondly, he has another idea which is about getting school kids involved in the design process, which all seems well and good. However, his project for schools, for kids in the kind of year 8 level of students, was to work out how we can use design to get them to understand how their schools can minimise their carbon footprint. So again, design here is being used in a way that is akin to fulfilling kind of wider political agendas, and to kind of get kids to adhere to, if you like, this sustainable agenda, rather than perhaps to let kids understand design, how it can be used to transform the world through better use of technology and using more resources in more innovative, creative ways. So that, to me, is quite interesting. And thirdly, his last kind of example I'll come on to today is the idea of he wanted to understand how we can use local transport to minimise, again, its impact on the local area and resources and environment, which basically for him came down to ride sharing. So instead of arguing that we need better, more supplied and financed infrastructure for transport, it came down to using cars that will be shared between more drivers and less. So these are kind of interesting examples of how design is being used with regard to tell us about the modern world, how we want to live for the future. In my view, this is the opposite of the case. And more importantly, it's placing the responsibility on us to change our behaviour. To change our behaviour in terms of how we live our lives, and in fact what we demand from the environment and even demand from each other. So it's a kind of complete inversion of what I think design is about. Design should be about inspiring us through experimentation, creativity, and new innovative ways about how we can use the natural world to actually bring out modern standards of living up to where we need it and beyond. So I think really, for me, I'm very suspicious about how we use design to change behaviour, because I'm more of the view that it probably has a negative effect rather than opens up new possibilities.
Very good, thank you very much. Any trouble all with applause there, sorry. Molly.
Hi, I'm Molly Webb. I come at this from the question, or the perspective of trying to do something about climate change. So in 5 minutes, not very much that I can say, but I'm going to try and make we'll discuss two main things. The first is what I think climate change is, and the second, and why I think it's an interesting problem. And the second is broadly what kinds of, why I think design can play a role. I'm actually, right now, in case you want to ask me about later what I'm actually doing, I'm working on a project on information and communications technologies and its enabling role in climate change. So a little different than your introduction, but that's for your information. So climate change, what is it? It's certainly, there are scientific explanations, 42 gigatons of CO2 every year into the atmosphere. There's a debate about the science. There's Stern's definition, which is it's the biggest market failure of all time. I like to think of it as climate change is what's happening when a lot of people are on the planet are doing whatever they do every day. So I guess the more technical way of saying that would be climate change is an emergent property of 6.5 billion people being in the world doing industrial activity, commercial activity, personal, whatever, entertaining themselves. So is this emergent property, climate change, a design problem? Did we really screw up somewhere and on purpose create this terrible problem that we now think we face? And I realize there are a whole lot of assumptions that go into the climate change problem, and we've had discussions about that at this conference in the last couple of days. But I don't think it's a design problem. I don't think we meant for it to happen. I don't think you can point a finger at any government or individual and say, why can't you solve this? So I think what it demonstrates is we're pretty bad at predicting the future. We really aren't that good at planning society and planning all the outcomes. We're often surprised, things are often unexpected and often undesirable. So what does, in my mind, design help us do, given the fact that we are really bad at this? I guess I would agree with Martyn that I think design can show us what's possible. It can demonstrate different ways of living and working that we might not have thought were possible. So it's those design approaches that I find fascinating. There's an example I'm going to use from the report that you mentioned, which is green homes. It's essentially a services design project where Robin Murray, who's been working on waste and various things in London for years, he wanted to understand how people think about energy in the home. So this service is designed to look at not just your home and not just the technologies you could use in your home, but how they're used. So I guess in design approaches, a use-centered approach where you try and understand not just the things in our world, like the chairs and the building and the technology, but how people use them and how they interact with them. And you watch that process. These design approaches are often about prototyping. So you create a way of watching those interactions happen. You don't just design something to make it look prettier, you design it with use in mind from the beginning. So I guess those are the two main things I wanted to say. Climate change, I don't think, is something designers should solve. It's not an ethical imperative, but designers have something really interesting to bring to this problem in helping us see different ways of looking at the future, in helping us to adapt, potentially mitigate climate change. It also it's very interesting to think about where the scope is for design to play a role that government and business maybe can't play in helping us to prevent the next climate change, whatever that is. What are the next major problems that are going to emerge from all of us interacting together? I think design might have an edge on some of the other approaches that we normally take around those problems.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Martyn. Thank you for the spontaneity, and now Johnny.
Okay, hello. I started taking the title quite literally, designing behaviour, and I wondered why would we want to redesign behaviour or influence behaviour? I think it's due to harmfulness. There's a concern that we're harming ourselves, harming each other, harming the environment, and it's all tied up with our consumption of products and so on. So I think that we do need to change our behaviour, but I think we're putting too much emphasis on the power that designers have. I think designers play a very small part in this. I think what designers do is make things desirable and attractive and help us decide which of what we want to choose. We can make things affordable, better looking, easier to use and so on. So we help provide choice, but we're not really involved in the end of things, I think, where products come into existence. And I think what I wanted to do was just quickly kind of look at the key players in this process. You know, we have designers, we have industry, we have non-governmental organisations, consumers, although I hate that word, but for this purpose it makes sense, and government. And when it comes to industry, I think that's where a lot of the crucial stuff happens. That's where products are conceived, it's where they're developed, and it could be a service, it could be an idea, it could be a way of thinking about flight, but that's where it comes into existence. TVs, phones, ready meals, cheap flights, video games, mobile phones, SUVs, all these things exist. They do have a massive impact on our behaviour. But design is simply helping us choose which SUV, BMW or Mercedes, EasyJet or Ryanair. So I don't think it can help there. I think that NGOs play a really important part. They raise awareness about the impact of a lot of, especially technology, has on the environment. This sort of makes us feel really guilty. I mean, there's not much we can do. We know it's bad, we know consuming can be wrong, but there aren't any ways forward. So we end up sort of stressed, frustrated, anxious, and we continue to consume. From a consumer point of view, I think there's a lot of unfairness. I think that we're faced with existing choices. It's not our fault that SUVs are still produced, and where are our electric cars? We were promised those years ago. If they were there, I'm sure more people would buy them. And it really annoys me when there are discussions about taxing individuals to use their cars less, or putting pressures on us to change our behaviour, especially financially, when these things originate through an industrial process that we have little influence over. I think finally there's the governmental angle, and what they're really good at is regulating stuff. And I started to wonder, there are mechanisms, for example, of regulating the development of drugs and pharmaceuticals and other things that are risky or may harm us. There's a big debate about nuclear energy, for example. What if the hazards of consumer products, the psychological and social and emotional damage they can produce, needed to be regulated? And before you introduced a new electronic product or system or service, it had to go through stringent tests to ensure that its social or cultural implications weren't going to be harmful. I think this is highly unlikely and not very desirable. So I'm going to come back to design. And I think that the role of design at the moment is extremely limited. We're very reactive. We respond to what industry asks us to do, and we try to ensure that these things enter society in as smooth and effective a way as possible. But I think we could start to take on more responsibility as a profession and start to look at how these different institutions and so on interact, NGOs, government, industry, consumers, design, and start to imagine how different interactions in relation to different technologies or different industries might result in different kinds of products, experiences, and so on. And one of the great things about design is we can really visualize those possibilities and make them tangible, and then hopefully have a kind of debate or discussion about what actually is what we want, many different futures rather than one great vision. So I think it's, returning again to the idea that all we can do as designers is offer choices really, rather than change behavior. But I think the choices we can offer, there is so much more potential in offering different styles of mobile phone or car. We can offer very different visions about how much the government should intervene in regulating the production of certain technologies, for example, and present those in a way that's engaging and imaginative and inspiring. And I believe that that's possible, but I'm not sure how it's going to happen. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. Okay, look, there's not much time in this session, so I'm just going to ask quickly a couple of questions to the panel before coming out to you. So please gather your thoughts, and I'll see your hands in a minute. But Martyn, just quickly, are you suggesting in any way, shape or form that there's no moral duty on designers?
I think that it's a very interesting question, and I think that the designer is always going to have their own personal framework that they bring to solving a particular problem in the solution they create. I think that that's inevitable, and therefore, it's up to a client, for example, to bring in a certain kind of designer, given the certain outlet they have, to solve the problem they want solved. So, I think that that's as it is, as it always has been. However, I also think that the designer needs to be objective as much as possible and not get embroiled in political discussions about the merits of sustainability or climate change, but must be able to approach any problem with utmost objectivity, because it's only by doing that that you can create the best solution. By unrestricted access to resources and materials and thinking, you really come up with the best outcome. Unless you do that, then I think it's wrong.
Right, thanks. Molly, in terms of designers and climate change, are you posing designers as having any responsibility for causing global warming or not?
No. No responsibility in causing it. If there are people who feel like they want to take the ethical or moral or responsible approach to climate change, then they could use some of the design principles or some of the approaches that designers have developed. I'm not saying designers have to do it themselves. I think that we are bad at imagining the future, so how can we get better at making sure that our impacts are maybe more what we desire and not so expected?
Yeah, and that desirability, so that's the point, isn't it? I don't understand the contradiction there, because you are saying that designers can produce more responsible outcomes.
No, their approaches can lead to that, but they don't have to, so.
Right, so what, because obviously you say that climate change is partly caused by 6.5 billion people indulging in industrial activity. Presumably design is to a certain extent a product-led activity. Obsolescence is the kind of phenomenon in the design discussion today. Designers make consumer goods,
I don't think we've applied design to that problem as a solution to that problem, so wouldn't it be interesting if we tried? But I'm not saying design has the responsibility to lead that. The profession of designers doesn't have the responsibility to lead that.
Who does?
It would be up to the people who decided they wanted to take on that responsibility.
All right, okay. Tony, just really developing that idea really about the role of design. You said designers have the ability to come up with visions for the future. To a certain extent, that's partly the way you sort of pause the difference between design thinking and just kind of ordinary Jack-led thinking. But part of the problem is surely that we are in a societal framework where climate change is the orthodoxy, that's what frames our discourse. And therefore, rather than this kind of design with lots of fantastically radical visions, 360-degree visions of the world, there's a very tunnel vision being approached to design, isn't there? You know, if you don't solve the carbon counting performance indicator tick box, then it's not worth designing to some degree. So climate change, the social vision is driving design in a different direction. So designers, far from having a fantastic visionary view of the future, are actually completely compliant in the orthodoxy.
Yeah, well, I think there's a short-term issue, which is design practice now in relation to industrial production has to change. We have to become more responsible in how we work with clients. And as Molly said, there are ways of going about doing that, so applying certain ways of thinking. But again, if designers aren't coming up with the products, they're not producing the industries that generate these things. They're participants along with many other people, and we can only do a certain amount. Whereas we do have other skills where we can. And when I talk about visualizing the futures, I'm not talking about sort of fantastical, slick, technological type things, but trying to imagine, for example, if you look at the pharmaceutical industry and how it regulates drug development, are there any areas of consumer technologies that would benefit from that kind of regulation in a sort of what-if sense? It doesn't necessarily mean it's a good idea. To see if we might come up with a very different way of conceptualizing. Are certain technologies equivalent to weapons? Should they be banned? Should we have licenses to use and enjoy other technologies? And to see through the consequences of that, present it so we can see what kind of consumer landscape we might have within a bigger context of climate change, and debate it. So it's not rushing ahead and trying to make some fantastical future, but working in relation to existing structures and mechanisms.
I'm a great believer in rushing into a fantastic future myself, but right, we're having a slight agitation on the right. A quick comeback and then we'll come back to you.
I mean, firstly, I would resist any notion that designers can work with others to regulate further aspects of society or business or whatever you want. It should be up to anyone who uses that design to decide how they want to use it and commission it. But also, very quickly, hopefully I can explain this quickly, when you started talking about the green homes idea you described earlier, you posited the idea that design really makes an impact when it looks at how people use stuff, consumption, energy and so on. You see, that's a very one-sided view of what design is really about, because to me, design is not just looking at how people use services, but it should also be about how we produce energy production as well, and actually come up with, again, more inspirational sort of angles about, say, nuclear power and everything else. And it's a real failure, I think, of the design establishment, where we really think about designers now as being able to describe how people consume, use, and make do with services. It's a very one-sided picture of what design really should be for.
Okay, any hands, please? Is there a microphone? Yes. Can we have one of you guys down the front here and one at the back? Thanks. Can we take that guy in the very, very back and this gentleman here? Very fast, sorry.
Sorry, I missed the class of discussion, but because I had to eat some food. Molly said earlier on that designers can't solve climate change, but I'd like to ask why not. I think she sort of tempted to answer that a little bit later by basically saying that we're not given the design brief to do that. But what about this as a design brief? CO2 is produced by petrol-fired power stations. How can it be used and treated as an actual resource that is useful rather than just an unpleasant pollutant? Because after all, it is a main part in photosynthesis and so on. Well, that's just one sort of possible little example. I'm struck by how everything today basically is focused on in exactly the same way, about modifying our behaviour or getting us to change what we do. And climate change, I was in a session earlier about climate change, and one of the scientists speaking in that pointed out that there are several different possible ways to think about the problem and how to solve it, and we only ever get one, which is how to get us to battle our ignorance and consume less. And basically, that way of thinking, if we'd had that in the Victorian period, not only would we not be here today, we'd be still probably travelling around in steam trains and canal barges. But one particular example, I forget the name of the engineer, but the guy who dug out all of the sewers around London.
Bazalgette.
Bazalgette, that's it, yeah. They had a problem, a big problem. People were flushing their excrement directly into the Thames, and it was stinking the whole place up, and they didn't like it much in the House of Commons, and so on. And so they came to the solution, let's have a massive engineering project to solve this. I think if we had today's thinking around in those days, what we'd have instead is probably get designers to come up with a brief about how everyone can recycle their own feces, you know, sort of recyclable containers, and get everyone involved in that sort of way. So,
okay, thank you very much for that tasteful comment. The gentleman here at the front.
Yeah. I think I want to look a little bit at what design meant historically. I think we can only talk about design only with the rise of modernism, as in consumer society, as in designing for the masses. Before that, you had patronage. I think we kind of designers today forget that idea, forget that their main client, I mean, people say consumerism today as if it's a bad thing. But essentially, it's a radical shift. Do you want to go back to live in feudal times where the king and the priest decide what kind of things are designed or produced? Or do we want to like live in a kind of democracy that we've been doing for almost 100 years, where ideas are thrown in the public and judged by the public? I don't see any problem in that. The real problem, I think, with the designing classes today, and I think Tony and Molly to a certain extent kind of articulated that, is that you sort of like to go through the motions of modernist designers, but you're not quite sure why. So you're always looking for a reason. And ultimately, just giving people great things and solutions, and not even solutions, Martyn. Design could be about solutions for problems that are not there yet. So what's wrong with that? Let's have more is better. So I think there's that crisis, and what is the meaning of design? And that's why we see this shift. I remember my favorite example, because I'm an architect, Richard Rogers used to say in the 70s, well, basically, because obviously all the ideas of modernism had collapsed by then, he used to talk about solving the problems of the poor in the third world. And then finally, in the late 80s, early 90s, sustainability came about, and then, oh, let's jump on that bandwagon. So there's this kind of urge by designers and architects to find some sort of raison d'être, which is, justifies their existence and their actions. And I'm afraid today they're just going through the motions, absolutely not understanding why they're doing it.
Thank you very much. And the gentleman there, yeah.
Yeah, this is just a question for Tony, really. Tony, you mentioned that designers don't actually have the power or authority to design behaviour, but you still agreed that the behaviour needs to be changed and that governments have the power to do that, and that designers can help visualise how positive those behaviour changes can be. So aren't you really just arguing that designers provide a sort of sexy front end to quite authoritarian social engineering, and in doing that, conferring authority to quite discredited sort of political institutions?
That's not exactly what I meant. I said what I really meant, what I hope I meant, was that government is part of the whole mix, just as industry, just as individuals, and design is part of that. And that when we're trying to design our way out of this, or imagine our way out of this, we have to take into consideration the role that governments play. And we might conclude that they should be kept completely out of it, but we can't just imagine these utopian futures where, you know, we ignore all these kind of institutions and processes and so on. So I wasn't really suggesting that government should regulate for us or imagine the scenarios and then we should visualize them. It was more, just as architecture used to, and still does sometimes, take on the responsibility to imagine large-scale housing schemes or ways of redefining, you know, reacting to urban problems or so on. From a professional point of view, not because there's a client, maybe it's just a competition organised by the RIBA, for example. Design doesn't have any such equivalent role. It really defines itself in relation to industry. And what I'm suggesting is that as a profession, we find ways of initiating these kinds of projects, basically, that are grounded in existing structures and mechanisms that are imaginative and stimulating and show us different ways forward, not to predict or dogmatically say we should go in a certain way, but so that we can have a lively debate about what is the relationship between industry, government, consumerism, harmfulness to the planet. what are the implications for the different players, and which one should we be trying to push for. So it's quite a complex set of interactions, but what I find frustrating is there isn't a forum within the design profession, at least, for that kind of exploration. It can happen academically, it can happen very individualistically, but in both cases it isn't seen as very effective because it's not you know, engaging with supposedly real-world systems.
Right, well this is the real world, and this is a forum, so what's your personal take on what the answer to your own question is?
Well, my take on it would be to formulate a project, some kind of non-commercial project, bringing together a set of specialists. They could be political scientists, economists, but designers are in there, looking at different interactions between these players and starting to imagine. And it seems it might end up as a series of projects that would be in the form of a public exhibition. It could be in a series of pamphlets, discussions, forums like this, but much more focused. But my problem is how would such a thing be funded? You know, it's not a commercial activity, but it would be a project, really.
Okay.
I mean, in response to that, I previously mentioned sort of the Design of the Times example, DOT, which I think all the things you talk about are actually happening, because that is very much a government-funded example of putting design into practice to overcome social issues. And I think the outcomes of DOT are pretty low level. But I just want to, just to bring a more clear example to bear, there's a thing called the Open Health Programme. I'm not actually sure if it's still running, but it certainly was a few years ago, set up by Hilary Cottam, you might know, who won the Designer of the Year competition a couple of years back. I won't go into all the reasons why there's controversy around that, but she won it. And she led a programme called Open Health that focused on how to provide health education and practice for diabetics in Kent and Bolton. So the goal for her was to reduce the dependency on healthcare, which you might think is an admirable goal, because diabetics have a hell of a resource implication and demand a lot of funding to survive, basically, and live. However, I think that this is an example of where the government and design come together, and I think that they basically looked at the wrong kind of problem. So the quote from her website, what this is all about, is to say the challenge is not to build more hospitals or to streamline administration practices to reduce waiting lists, but rather for her it's to understand what will support individuals and communities in changing their behaviour and sustaining lifestyle changes. For her it's about motivation, not medicine, that's required. I think that is a complete outrage for a designer to become involved with, because it completely misses the point about what's needed. For me it's about greater understanding of medical science to overcome diabetes. It's not really a job for designers to prescribe to us about changing our behaviour. I think it's kind of the wrong way around. So I kind of disagree. So when design does become embroiled in government policy, I think they actually get really confused and it ends up making the problem far worse.
But I'm not talking about changing people's behaviour, I'm talking about speculating on a wide range of different scenarios, which we don't do at the moment. I think what's happening in DOT is very interesting, but I also think it's very basic and quite gestural. And I'm talking about maybe it's an intellectual project to try and really think through a set of models of how industry, government, consumers and design can interact, evaluate them, explore them, see if we can come up with an alternative to the one we have now. Maybe it's an economic and political project, but I think there's room for designers to participate in that. I wouldn't for 1 minute suggest that we change people's behaviour or try to, but I think we can offer up these different visions, really.
Can I come back on that? We actually developed a joint proposal to do something like that, but around climate change, if you remember, Amy. And we didn't win it, but Nesta, who we bid in to do that project with, has actually developed an X Prize for communities to address climate change. And it's more than an X Prize, it's really an experiment process. It's a fascinating model, actually. They're going to pick 10 finalists and work with them over a year and fund everything they do at the community level, looking at climate change solutions. It's an amazing opportunity for designers and various, industry, business, everyone to work together to try and test or rethink some of those structures. So coming back to your question at the back, should designers, or why can't they solve climate change? Well, this would be one space where they could experiment alongside other people who are interested in that, those solutions, and see if they could come up with an alternative. The other was your point basically that designers are in a crisis of meaning? And I think maybe that's not just an issue facing the design profession. I think there's a lot of that going on at the moment. So I think that maybe without addressing that, I'm thinking of much more practical sort of ways that designers can be working together with others around issues that they do think are meaningful. And I just kind of wanted to point out, what I'm trying to get at is something like avoiding some of the myths or some of the things that we believe will happen if we implement a certain technology or if we don't. So the paperless office is the biggest myth ever. If we had had a bit of prototyping or thinking about that in real time, we might have found that actually implementing all kinds of digital technologies isn't going to reduce paper in the way that we expected. So all of those dependencies become quite interesting if you play them out, rather than if you just sort of start to predict.
Just on that, Molly, the crisis of confidence question, which you said is actually quite essential to this general problem, and it's a social problem, not necessarily related to designers. But you then sort of said that's kind of quite a difficult, big issue, and you want to go for smaller, pragmatic gains. I mean, therefore, but those smaller, pragmatic gains must then feed and live off the general malaise which you've already identified but can't address. You know what I mean?
Well, I mean, what is the meaning of being a politician, or what is the meaning of being almost anything? It's a difficult thing to address, but if you can start to break that into different projects that do give meaning for your own benefit, I think that's. I'm not going to address the issue of whether designers are in that crisis.
I mean, quickly on that, because I see it as a problem, because when the design establishment adopts sustainability as the agenda, what do? We come up with local solutions, right? When we adopt that agenda about sustainability, it's very narrow in my opinion, because the solution to sustainability, if you agree with it or not, in terms of energy reduction, is not at the local level at all. It's at the national or international level, about producing a network of power stations, so nuclear and everything else. So I always think that every time a design establishment adopts this sort of prevailing political agenda, whether it be about sustainability or healthcare, they end up with very narrowly focused solutions, which actually do more damage to creativity, I think, than solve.
But with the nuclear thing, for example, there was an interesting book written in the 80s called The Whale and the Reactor. It's kind of looking at the sort of political implications of implementing different technologies. When it comes to nuclear power, I can't remember the author's name, he's talking about the kind of political system that would have to come with extensive applications of nuclear technology. This highly risky but super efficient technology would bring with it a requirement for super security, total monitoring and so on. And say compared to decentralized solar power or something like that, whether it's technically feasible or not, the idea that people can be left to look after it themselves and exchange energy and manage it in a kind of market sense like we have today gives rise to another kind of set of social interactions and so on. And I think it's that kind of level that I'm talking about. The design can play a part in seeing through what the day-to-day implications of those different choices might be, allowing us to debate on a much more down-to-earth way rather than a very lofty way.
Okay, good. It's probably going to be the last round. It's a very short session, this one, I'm afraid. So we can take the lady here and gentleman there. And I'll come to you. These two guys are here.
Yeah, thanks very much. I'm a PhD student in construction design, and what we do every day is try to use 3D computer system to try to simulate, human behavior towards certain kind of building. For example, if we try to design, sports stadium for Olympic Games, and we will design some sort of scenarios to try to see if, earthquake happens, how people react to that sort of, situation, and try to, improve the overall design. So for me, it seems as if we designers are trying to find, the underlying rules of people's behavior rather than just trying to change their behavior. So how far do you agree or disagree with this kind of argument? Thanks.
Thank you very much. Gentleman there, and then I'll take two there. Keep your hand up.
It just seems to me that The problem today, when designers stitch themselves up to designing within the policy framework, is that it just provides far too narrow a framework for people to be able to think experimentally within. And if we're talking about climate change, then because the whole debate starts off from the assumption that people are a problem, then inevitably the design solutions end up with the whole focus on changing behaviour. So, for example, you get in the paper today, the solution to mobility and moving around is actually for Ruth Kelly to set up a whole new counselling force to go in and counsel us about our mobility choices and how we can car share and all the rest of it. So the whole focus today is so narrowly bounded that we miss the opportunity to have a more interesting and enlightened approach to design and to actually start to design things where often we don't actually know when we're designing things what the benefits will be in the future. So someone in the session this morning mentioned that mobile phones these days are only used 12% of the time for actually making phone calls. So we've designed something where actually we've not really known the range of benefits that we'll get out of it in the future.
Thank you very much. Gentleman there, yeah.
Tim Martyn. It is working. Tim Martyn. For me, linked to the previous session on democracy is really important. I've spent my career crossing boundaries as a designer, a lecturer, political activist, and there's a point at which I really agree with Martyn Perks' appeal for objectivity for designers in their professional practice, but I have a real problem with them not appealing to designers to also get involved personally and politically in the political process, because we've got to rise, this argument and the argument about democracy has to be elevated to a higher philosophical level. We live in a society which is still fundamentally bound by commodity fetishism, which undermines the challenges of social needs and all the problems that stem out of that by rationalising all problems down to the level of proprietary technical solutions. And we endlessly wrestle with that. Now, designers do have an insight into the criteria which goes into the selections and the, if you like, determination of particular technical choices that are then packaged up and offered. But it's not part of their professional career, which I'm asking them to sacrifice. I'm asking them to use some of their talents as visualizers and conceptualizers to help people in the political process understand that those processes are going on. Inevitably, that sounds like a very confused response, but the other thing is demystifying design. It's now much more widely understood. It is part of the modernist project, that it's become such a specialized division of labour. But part of its job is to enable a democratisation of the whole understanding of production for society's real social needs.
Thank you very much. The gentleman next to you.
Hi, Nico MacDonald. Back in the day, I've been taught on Tony's course and I'm getting some good feedback here. I think Tony's been slightly caricatured in that his students' work, if you come to the summer show here, is about envisioning and not about designing behaviours per se and imagining possible scenarios. But I do wonder the extent to which these models are being advocated, both of designing behaviour and of envisioning the future, how well the various organisations and bodies that are advocating this model are actually educating designers with the kind of knowledge and insight they might need to be able to envision in this way. So that would be educational bodies such as the Royal College, the Design Council and other government bodies, and professional bodies such as the CSD and the DNAD. If they're not, what does that say about the motivations of these kind of programs? Given the fact that actually I haven't found very many designers at events such as this, where we might expect people who are looking for a worldly point of view to be engaged in debate, or at events at the RSA, the Royal Institution and so on, which would enlighten them to be citizens who can design, envision the future, think more broadly about how we might move forward. So, are we actually walking the talk, if you like, in terms of how we educate designers?
Thank you very much. And the final comment here.
Yeah, I just had a slight problem with Martyn's underlying assumption that there's only the sort of sustainability crowd who's trying to impose a certain point of view upon people's way of behaving, frame preference. You say, for example, in the beginning that in schools we are now imposing a political agenda on children to use less stuff, whereas we should be teaching them to transform the world by using more stuff and more resources. I think that's a quite sort of impoverished idea of what progress really means and what the most interesting sort of creativity is. Just like the idea that we should be as bold in building as big engineering solutions as the Victorians did. Well, I think they were just responding creatively and to the best knowledge of the time to political and social issues they were seeing at that time. And I just feel that a lot of the issues that we're grappling now with are very different than those at the time, that big solutions aren't necessarily the best and most creative and most optimal way of spending our energy. So I think it's this underlying idea that it is only big engineering solutions which are creative solutions, whereas small local community solutions could in fact be more creative, more up to the time, and also more interesting things for designers to engage with.
Thank you very much. Okay, that's your lot. We're just going to sum up with a snappy 90-second piece which brings it all together, and then we can all go home relaxed. Tony.
Okay, I think that designers need to end their love affair with counting technological change in terms of progress. And we need to start really thinking about intellectual progress, how our understanding of the world and how we can act on it can be developed. And I'm not sure how to do that, but that's what I'd like to see start to happen.
Very good, thank you.
I think that if design could help to pick apart the assumptions that go into politics into this debate in particular, as one of the first people asked, it would be a huge benefit. So I think that is all that I'm looking for, is a way to not shoehorn design into the existing black box of how we choose to solve the problem today. It's about reimagining it. It's about getting new insights from new places, and it's about being as creative as we can be on this particular issue.
Thank you, Martyn.
Just quickly on your points, yes, I probably do obsess about stuff and big stuff a bit too much. I mean, what I really mean is I want unrestricted access to new ideas, new thinking, as well as stuff, mud, resources, rocks, whatever it might be, because I think it all helps to build a better world. And very finally, I think that we're at risk of, I think, using design in a very, shall I say, risk-averse way, actually, because all the talk about prototyping we had earlier, scenario planning and so on, as well as being quite useful in terms of imagining the future, can also predetermine ideas and say, actually, I'm not really going to bother to do anything over there because I can't actually understand the outcome before I actually put pen to paper. And I think that's kind of also anathema to creativity, as the guy said over there. Sometimes the outcomes aren't really known, but you actually do benefit a lot more from them when you actually start to get to that point in the future where they realise. So I think the design needs to be far more creative and less risk-averse, and then it really can make a big difference.
Thank you very much. Can we thank the speakers, please? The guy who's just come in, you missed a cracking session, mate. But just to say, from my point of view, especially for the last question, when people say less is more, I hate to break it to them, but it's actually just less. And I think we should be striving for more stuff. It's an aspirational, ambitious vision, which is really what we're trying to exemplify here, I think. And for me, two examples that Molly gave on the green, well, just one of them, the green homes thing, it's about as radical as a poke in the eye. I mean, everybody from the DCLG all the way through to every government organisation you can think of is pushing green home initiatives and what have you. So it does, the idea that designers are being radical in what they're advocating these days is actually a little bit of a myth. And what Martyn said at the end about risk aversion, I hate to say, talking about that was the sort of social framework in which you seem to be kind of operating, which is precautionary principle, which never really gave rise to great innovation at all. So I sort of think one of the guys at the back said that, you know, designers can be involved in this process, but only once they forget their professional life. If the designers as human beings engage in the political discourse, that's one thing. Designers changing the world through design ain't going to happen, which I think you probably agree with. Anyway, that's my talk, and that's worth. Thank you very much for listening.